Hello. My Cuban father came to the United States in 1936 to go to college, and he never went back. He was one of 14 children, so I have a lot of cousins. There are 12 of us still living in the United States and 9 in Cuba. Politically, I've always been a left-leaning Democrat, kind of like Hubert Humphrey, except I never thought the Vietnam War was a good idea. And see me at intermission if you don't know who Hubert Humphrey is. Because of my family's history, I couldn't share the enthusiasm of some of my Marxist friends in college for the Castro Revolution. At that time, my uncle Hector was doing forced labor in Cuba. His offense had been insufficient enthusiasm as a high school teacher for Castro. His son-in-law, who was more outspoken, disappeared and was never seen again. So I knew that the years immediately following the revolution had been very hard, but I was still unprepared for what I found when I visited Cuba for the first time in 1997. I guess 6 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, I was expecting society in transition, some kind of Cuban perestroika or glasnost. But when I met my cousin Oscar the first night in Havana, he asked me, "What do you do for a living?" I said, "I'm a software developer, and you?" He said, "Well, I'm a member of the party." He's actually a nuclear physicist, but that was less important. That was my first clue that I was not in a society in transition or being restructured. It was a fully armed and functioning totalitarian society. Here's the family in 1943. Cuba had just been an independent nation for 21 years at the time. All these people, my aunts and uncles, my grandparents, were ardent supporters of the Castro Revolution at first, in 1959. But by 1963, they had divided. My father, my Uncle Raul, my Uncle Filiberto stayed in the U.S. They were here already. A couple of aunts and uncles returned to Cuba from elsewhere to become party people. Several stayed in Cuba and went with the revolution. When I met my cousins in 1997, most of them had been educated in the Soviet Union, and they had professions that had been picked out for them by the party. For some, the party's a matter of conviction, but in any event, it's the way you get ahead in Cuba. This graffito was everywhere. The initials UJC stand for Young Communist League, and siempre means, contigo means with you. Sometimes the graffiti are more direct and say siempre contigo, always with you, always with Fidel, always with the revolution, but it also means the party is always with you. On every street corner, there's a sticker on the corner of a building with the initials CDR. CDR stands for Committee for the Defense of the Revolution. Whenever I visited a Cuban cousin in Havana or Holguin, there would be a discreet knock on the door a few minutes after we entered, and it would be a neighbor from the CDR asking who the people were that were visiting. It's estimated that 8 of every 11 Cubans are registered members of the CDR. Their motto is, "In every neighborhood, revolution." In Cuba, everything's either mandatory or it's illegal. There are cops everywhere. They're in uniform, they're in plain clothes, and then you have the CDR right next door. So you will get caught. We hired a driver to take us to the east end of the island, to Holguin, to visit the rest of my cousins. When we were en route, we discovered that was illegal because the driver we hired was not a government taxi driver. After he delivered us to Holguin, he was in fact hauled in and fined and lost all the money we had paid him because the government taxi drivers at the hotel had dropped the dime on him. Your guides, when you go on a cultural tour of Cuba, don't usually point out these things. So a lot of my friends, maybe some of you, have said, "Oh, I'm so anxious to visit Cuba. I want to get there before it all changes." And believe me, we all want it to change. Despite all the police surveillance, I had a wonderful time visiting my warm family there. We'll see a picture in a minute of us having a typical rollicking Cuban after-dinner conversation, which we call a sobremesa. That's my Uncle Raul at the head of the table holding forth, and his sister Cuca sitting on his left. That's her house. Cuca has a picture of Castro over her bed where Jesus probably was before the revolution. After 40 years, the rest of us who were around the table had a lot of catching up to do. We had a lot of family stories and jokes to catch up on. The rest of us around the table are the usual mix, 50-50 mix of people with the revolution and people from Los Estados Unidos. A lot of us met again here in Miami in 2018, and I'm going to see them again in 2 weeks. So if you have questions that you'd like me to take along, let me know at intermission. Some of these people escaped on balsa wood rafts since I visited them in Cuba in the first place. Some of them were rescued in the Mariel boat lift in 1980. Several actually have come from Cuba since I met them first, some legally, and at least one by wading across the Rio Grande to Texas. A couple of the visitors here actually are from Cuba. They were visiting from Cuba. And when we're together like this, there's a lot of shouting and laughing and eating and hugging. We don't discuss politics very much. We do know how to get along. Thank you.